Hey,
Hey,
what's
man.
going on? All right, Jeremy Scahill of Dropsite News joining us live right now. Jeremy, wonderful to have you on as always. Phenomenal work so far. Heard you on your old stomping grounds earlier in the morning at Democracy Now, talking about what you're going to be talking about right now, the Memorandum of Understanding, to sign the Memorandum of Understanding, which will unlock a 60-day ceasefire period between Iran, the United States of America, and maybe with Israel as well. There's a lot of naysayers. I'm very critical of this deal, but I wanted to hear your perspective as someone who, as a brilliant investigative reporter, goes and talks to the people on the other side. So let's begin.
Yeah, I'll just back up a little bit. Last night, I was in touch with an Iranian source and was asking, what the response was going to look like to the fact that the Israelis had bombed, Dahia, the southern suburb of Beirut, and the Iranians had said some weeks ago, and then they followed through on it, that if Netanyahu and the Israelis started attacking Beirut, that Iran was going to respond. And it was a significant sort of turning point in this process because the Israelis had consistently violated the terms of the April agreement that J.D. Vance brokered in Islamabad with the Iranians. The Lebanon was supposed to have a ceasefire as part of the original agreement that the Trump administration made with the Iranians that was meant to then open up the space to negotiate a deal that then started to be referred to as an initial memorandum of understanding. And then Trump and Netanyahu tried to carve out this alternative path where they started working with the president of Lebanon, Joseph Aoun, and they created their own kind of fraudulent so-called peace process. The stated intent of it from the Israeli and American side was to try to enlist the Lebanese government as their kind of domestic troops against Hezbollah. And in fact, the president of Lebanon, 2 weeks ago, or a little bit less than 2 weeks ago, actually issued a public statement when the Iranians were demanding that the ceasefire apply to Lebanon, basically telling the Iranians to stay out of Lebanon's business, which then got him criticized by a lot of people within Lebanon itself. But the Iranians had stopped short of taking military action against those ceasefire violations, even though they felt that they would have been justified. But then when Netanyahu started pushing his forces, Israel's forces north of the Litani River, occupying more swaths of Lebanese land, killing more Lebanese civilians, and then threatening to bomb Beirut, the Iranians said, if you do that, we're going to come in and respond to that. And that happened. And I think that took a lot of people by surprise because this was a rather extraordinary moment. In the middle of these high stakes negotiations with the Americans, the Iranians struck back against Israel, not for bombing Iran, but for bombing Lebanon. And I think for a lot of people, that was sending a message that Iran really meant it when they said that this was a red line. And so Trump also had said this wasn't going to happen again. So when it did happen yesterday, the Iranians were saying, we're going to respond. And I was about to go with a story based on what I was hearing from Iranian officials that they were going to strike. At one point, I was told the strikes were going to begin within 1 hour. And so as I was preparing that post, I was going back and I was saying, so you're certain that this is happening? Yes, we're certain that this is happening. And then I got a message, wait, hold up a second, something has happened. I turn on Jazeera and I see Donald Trump is saying, oh, there's going to be an imminent deal. And then while I'm talking with the Iranian official, the Pakistani prime minister posts on Twitter that the two sides have agreed to this deal. Now, what I heard immediately after that was that it was a unilateral announcement. And so the Iranians and by the way, there were Qatari officials in Tehran at this moment. One of the background stories here is that Qatar really took over the prime position of mediator behind the scenes, in part because the Pakistanis were really unable to kind of seal the deal. I mean, it's a real thing. And Qatar has a complicated relationship with Trump. There's financial interwoven interests with Jared Kushner. There was the long history with the Gaza deal. And so the Qataris have really been the closers of this. And the Iranians speak in a much more kind of respectful, it's not that they're disrespecting the Pakistanis, but they speak in a more serious way about the Qataris and felt that they were better assessors of what Trump was actually willing to do and what he wasn't willing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so once that announcement was made, there was a flurry of discussions with the mediators, and they were all begging Iran not to strike Israel. And the Iranians, I'm told, then said, okay, there's a couple of outstanding issues here that were not resolved before you guys made this announcement. So if you want this thing to stick, you're going to have to meet us where we've stated. So the Iranian narrative on this, and again, we haven't seen the text of this memorandum of understanding, and it could actually crumble because of that, because Trump is saying one thing. He's saying it has certain conditions in it. The Iranians are saying something different. But what I understand is that the Iranians did feel that they got concessions that they wouldn't have gotten had Netanyahu not done that strike and the Iranians not decided to say, okay, we're not going to retaliate against them right now. The Iranian narrative on this is that they got Trump to agree to a much swifter lifting of the military blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, that they were able to get Trump to agree to some sort of conditions on financial aspect of this. Again, we haven't seen the text yet. So, and it's hard, there's different interests also. When you talk about Iranian media, it's not a monolith. You have different media outlets that are close to different entities within Iran. And in fact, at one point, the state broadcaster of Iran today, IRIB, actually posted on Twitter, there are only 2 state news agencies in Iran, because they were kind of clarifying that there was a lot of misinformation where people were saying state-affiliated news agency about news agencies that aren't. But what we understand is that the Iranians felt that they had gotten substantial enough concessions that they didn't go forward then with striking Israel. There are conflicting reports, and this is really to put a fine point on it. I believe that Lebanon is going to be the key to whether or not any actual short-term or medium-term deal happens, because Netanyahu and his defense minister both came out today and said we're remaining entrenched where we are inside of Lebanon, and that Trump is making a deal with Iran, but we're our own entity and we have a right to set our own policy. So they're saying they're not going to withdraw. Some Iranian sources have indicated that Trump said he would get the Israelis to withdraw. Other Iranian sources that I think are actually more likely giving a realistic assessment is that there's some language about the sovereignty and unity of Lebanon and some provision that states that Iran has a right to self-defense. And the Iranians, I think, would define violating the ceasefire, continuing to attack Lebanon under that umbrella. So that's a point that could raise some contention. But clearly, the Israelis want to try to sabotage this before it even gets going. I would say in the big picture, Hassan, that Trump made some massive capitulations here. I don't think there's any way to other way to slice it.
Yeah.
He's sitting there in France with Macron, a short time before you and I started talking. And he's saying the most important thing is Iran is saying that they're not going to have a nuclear weapon. Well, not only has that been policy of Iran for a couple of decades, but if you go back and read the preamble to the 2015 JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal negotiated under Obama, in the preamble to that agreement, Iran says the exact same thing that Trump is celebrating as a victory right now, which is that Iran agrees not just to not develop a nuclear weapon, but to pursue or acquire one in any form. That was already in the deal. Trump is saying, oh, and the Strait of Hormuz is going to be opened, and look at how oil is coming back down, and it's going to take some days, but we're gonna get that strait opened up. Well, the Strait of Hormuz was open before this thing happened. Yeah. The other thing, and I think perhaps most significant in terms of the capitulation narrative, is that if you go back and look at what the Iranians were telling me and other journalists, and at times what they were even saying publicly before the war started, Iran was entering those negotiations with the Trump's Gulf buddies. I started saying that like the Iranians sent people with PhDs to the negotiations, and Trump sends people with last week's golf scores to the negotiations. But the Iranians were there willing to put a lot of things on the table. And right now, what's not being discussed is Iran's ballistic missile program.
Yeah.
Right now, the Iranians are saying that they're open to a dilution of the highly enriched uranium that is above 60%, but that it's going to happen within Iran. And Trump himself has now started indicating that that's what he is willing to accept. But to be clear, the nuclear issue has nothing to do with this first memorandum of understanding. The memorandum of understanding covers the Strait of Hormuz, a cessation of the hostilities, and then an initial unlocking of frozen Iranian assets. Trump and J.D. Vance have kind of shifted how they talk about this now. I had been told 2 or 3 days ago by an Iranian official that it was unlikely that Trump was going to announce or publicly own any unfreezing of assets at the front end of this deal because he has been bashing Obama for it.
Yeah.
JD Vance today indicated that there may be some of that happening. Without question, money is going to Iran if it hasn't already.
Well,
the question
has,
is,
right?
how's it going to be spun?
We already know that
there are these reports about the Emiratis.
Yeah, that's what I was pointing to. Yeah,
yeah.
$3 billion to some total of, I believe, $20 billion has been reported. And the $3 billion is already actually flown into Iran directly from the UAE, is the initial reporting on this.
The Emiratis are denying this, and it may or may not be true that it's $3 billion or that it's the Emiratis, but I don't have any doubt that billions of dollars are going to be going to Iran as a result of this agreement. And I suspect that some already started flowing to them even before this. So the Iranians would also point to any shift that we see in that posture as a result of last night's kind of 11th hour decision not to strike Israel. So the Iranian narrative is that they were able to get more concessions out of Trump. On the bigger picture, though, and in some ways this is more important, I mentioned Lebanon. What I'm hearing from Iran is they don't have any faith that this is going to result in an actual long-term deal. I do think they genuinely would like to make a deal. I think Iran wants comprehensive sanctions relief. That would be the big prize of any nuclear negotiation with the United States. They just simply don't trust Donald Trump, and they certainly don't trust Netanyahu. And what they're saying is, in the medium term, we assess that Trump and Netanyahu are going to try to decouple Iran and Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance.
Yeah.
And the Iranian and Hezbollah strategy is we're going to try to decouple Israel from the United States in terms of the next front of this war. Israel, without a doubt, is going to intensify its covert actions inside of Iran. Israel is going to try to destabilize the Iranian state. Israel wants to recreate a more intense, larger scale version of the violent episodes that we saw in January of 2026. There's no question about that. But right now, there's internal debate within Iran. Some fairly prominent political forces in Iran were very much against this deal. There were protests against Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, against Mohammad Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament and the lead negotiator, at times even calling, in quite violent ways for them to be removed from the process. But in general, Iran, I believe, is a nation of institutions and structure, and I don't believe that the Iranians would go forward with this deal unless there was buy-in and approval at the highest levels of political, military, and religious power in the country.
Yeah. One of the questions I have, and I think this is a question on everybody's minds, is what kind of assurances could America have possibly given to Iran, and whether or not Iran basically took the additional concessions that Trump may have made in the last hour, opening up the Strait of Hormuz and removing the blockade that the Americans had in the Strait of Hormuz, not over the course of 30 days, but instantly, as Trump seemingly has been on board with now, and potentially the unfreezing of billions of dollars of assets. Is this basically a bribe for Iran to release their conditions on Lebanon, or is this a real commitment from Donald Trump that he will restrain Israel? Because as you and I have discussed in the past as well, that is the primary focus for long-term stability for Iran. Obviously, sanctions relief is the most consequential one for the Iranian economy to no longer suffer. And that volatility is what actually aids Israel's campaigns inside of Iran to, foment some kind of counter-revolution, to foment some kind of instability and whip up the masses into taking arms against the state potentially. But outside of that, I think that Iran understands that this is an existential crisis, and therefore their primary focus here is to get America to restrain Israel. Like, it's not necessarily, from my estimations, and I might be wrong on this, there are people who obviously care about Gaza inside of Iran, inside of the Iranian leadership. There are obviously people who care about the Lebanese population there as well. But their calculation almost seems very pragmatic, where they're looking at, if this is a game of proxies and there are different players involved, then they cannot allow Israel to continue behaving in this belligerent manner. Their entire ballistic munitions program is dedicated to ensuring that Israel cannot encroach on other countries in the ways that it has. So the best possible way to restrain Israel is by going to the United States of America and demanding this. What is your read on this? Has America given anything to Iran that shows that this is a real restraint upon Israel is going to happen here, because Israel is still continuously saying they're going to continue pummeling Lebanon.
As we speak right now, it's there is an interesting track of leverage that the Iranians remain firmly in control of, and that is that when they successfully broke the negotiations into two parts. Remember, Trump at the beginning was demanding that he was saying that the American military is going to go into Iran and retrieve the nuclear dust. He was saying it has to be a total surrender. He wanted all of this stuff to be part of whatever deal was going to be signed. That had to do with the nuclear issue, that had to do with ballistic missile range, that had to do with support for regional allies of Iran. None of that stuff is in this first part of the deal with any substance. And this was an Iranian plan. The Iranians were the ones that said this needs to be divided into two. The answer to your question in the short term right now, looking at this MOU, Hassan, is that the Iranians do not want the ability of the United States to pull back any of its commitments. And so they are making the phased process, the kind of sequencing of this, such that if the United States doesn't fulfill its obligations, it doesn't release Iranian funds, Netanyahu then resumes a large-scale attack on Beirut. The United States keeps military assets in the region. The United States continues some form of a military blockade, or they engage in some chicanery in the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian position is then we can counteract that and we can stop the process there. Now, that may be overstating Iran's ability, because Iran has to take into account its relationship with other countries and the fact that the situation in the Strait of Hormuz is also damaging the economy, the agricultural sector, the basic livelihood of many countries around the world that are friends of Iran. So the stakes for Iran of resuming this after we open the thing up, after things start to get normalized, would be high, and the narrative would be slightly different. But Iran has built this in. That's not something that existed in the JCPOA. Iran had very limited ability to fight back against U.S. breaking of commitments. So what I'm told by Iranians is we built this in a structured way so that we have an ability to enforce the agreement, not just the American side. And by the way, one of Iran's biggest problems right now is liquidity. Iran doesn't have cash. And it's not that Iran doesn't have resources or that Iran hasn't created a war economy. It has. But the cash flow situation is real, which is part of why they want the assets to be unfrozen at the front of this, why they want to be able to have some of these oil sanctions lifted at the front end, which I'm told the Iranians are getting out of Trump right now. But as we move then into that next phase, the Iranians now have to start asking, what leverage do we have as Trump starts focusing on the highly enriched uranium? The fear, I think, would be that the thing stretches on. Netanyahu starts getting away with it. Trump comes up with some new concocted narrative about it. And the Iranians then have to say, are we willing to now resume bombing Israel because of what they're doing in Lebanon? Are we willing to reimpose a kind of shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, or the attempt to limit any ships that are in any way affiliated with the United States or its allies? I don't think Iran's Arab neighbors want this thing to resume. The big story of this later is going to be, this has really transformed that region in a way that I don't think the neocons envisioned. I think the tone is shifting quite dramatically against Israel. And, the concern of the Iranians that were really critical of this deal was that Iran has never had and may never again have more leverage than it has right now. And they feel that this is still not enough protection to make a comprehensive deal, particularly with an erratic liar like Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's why I was bringing it up, because I feel like there's gimmies on both sides, right? For the American side, I think unfreezing of assets, especially through a more opaque funding structure, like by way of regional partners, is probably the easiest concession that the Americans can offer to the Iranians. And then on the Iranian side, given that they have already made prior concessions on the nuclear program, that has always felt like, to me, the gimme on the Iranian side for the Americans, to make the Americans look like they're actually, winning something here, despite the unfathomable amount of leverage that they've been able to fight for and successfully win in this process. And,
you brought up Gaza too.
Yeah, I was
Gaza, and I think, you've talked about this. I think it's actually worth talking a little bit about it. So I asked Iranian officials about this, and I was saying earlier today on Amy's show that, the answer on the Gaza question is not, I haven't found it a satisfying answer. I understand the logic of the Iranians, but I basically said, why aren't you making a bigger focus on Gaza? Israel, I mean, here's a statistic that's worth repeating. Israel has killed more Palestinians since the October 2025 ceasefire, has killed more Palestinians since that ceasefire was signed than Hamas and the other resistance groups killed Israeli civilians on October 7th.
Yeah.
Just in this period since the ceasefire.
Yeah.
The Israelis are violating every single day, every component of the ceasefire.
Yeah.
And so, when we say the Iranians at one point did start saying, all regional actors,
including Syria as well, right? They were demanding
all theaters. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Iraq in particular. So, but the Iranian answer on this is twofold. One is there already is a process that the Palestinian leadership has agreed to participate in, these negotiations with this so-called Board of Peace. There is a United Nations Security Council resolution. The Palestinian delegation, as we speak, remains in Cairo, where it just delivered a response to a proposal on how to move forward addressing Israel's violations of phase one of the ceasefire deal, and they're demanding that Hamas disarm, and there's a whole process. So they're saying the Palestinians have this process. And by the way, Iran is in touch with the Palestinian leadership. There was a call between Abbas Araghchi and Khalil al-Hayya, the lead negotiator for Hamas recently. Hamas has a representative to Iran. There are warm, as they would say, brotherly relations between the two. But Hamas never has had the type of relationship with Iran that Hezbollah did. This is a media concocted story. The idea that Iran was the sort of mastermind behind October 7th is pure lies. It's complete and total lie. The Palestinians are a national liberation movement, and they are overwhelmingly funded and fueled by their own ingenuity and an assortment of their allies. It's not that Iran isn't an ally of the Palestinian resistance. Of course it is. But Hezbollah and Iran have a much deeper partnership that Hassan Nasrallah himself openly spoke about, that the Iranians openly speak about. It was Hezbollah that decided to join the front when the United States and Israel attacked Iran on February 28th. A couple of days later, Hezbollah fully joined the front. Hamas has not fired a single rocket at Israel since the ceasefire. So what the Iranians are saying is the conditions are different, and what they'll say in their defense, and they don't take a defensive tone. They're saying that on a strategic level, their view is if they don't defend the Lebanese front, that if they don't prevent the Israelis from running the deck, that this is going to have a catastrophic impact on the Palestinians, because the only real force that stood up after October 7th alongside the Palestinians was Hezbollah. This is their closest ally directly next to them. So Iran's argument would be if we lose this, and if we somehow were to abandon Hezbollah, it would also be an abandonment of the Palestinians. And we're trying to approach this in a strategic way, but we have not forgotten about Gaza. That's their position on
and
this.
There's also, from what I understand, I mean, the talks are going to continue, and I assume that the cessation of hostilities in numerous theaters is going to expand as the talks expand as well. Just as when they look at the fine print of like the denuclearization side of things in the 60-day ceasefire period, if they sign the MOU without Israel trying to ruin it in some meaningful way. I suspect that there will be more talks. There will be further talks about like what Israeli restraint looks like later down the line. Do you agree with that?
We have to look, I think, also at the Israeli elections. I mean, you look at what passes as the left, in establishment Israeli politics.
Yeah, they left Israel.
Right. But I'm talking about, though, even at the level of political opposition parties running against Netanyahu, whether it's Lapid or Gantz or others, the rhetoric about Netanyahu is that he didn't go far enough, that it was a failure.
Oh yeah.
That he's lost against Hezbollah, that they're still killing our soldiers, that they lost against Hamas, they're still refusing to disarm, and they still control 30 or 40% of Gaza, that the Iranian state is still intact, to the point where right before you and I came on the air, Netanyahu is, giving this speech, and he's saying, "Oh, we're going to remain in our positions inside of Lebanon." And then he says, "We never said that our goal was to overthrow the Iranian government. It was to destabilize it and create the conditions so that the Iranian people could rise up, and we still maintain that track." But I bring this up because this is going to be an election issue. And Netanyahu said he is seeking the office again, that he is running again. And so I think that the motivation and the desire for the Israelis to keep this war or even escalate it in Lebanon is very much on the table. And I think we're going to see in very real terms how far Trump actually would be willing to go. The Israelis are arguing that maybe a conflict with the United States on this level is necessary, that we need to assert our right to continue doing that. What the Axis of Resistance forces have said over and over is, let's see what Israel does when it's on its own, when it doesn't have the United States constantly backing it up and trying to make excuses for it, not to mention arming it to the teeth. My suspicion is Trump's not going to do anything, that Trump's going to try to come up with some fake, justification for it, or call for calm, or go to Barack Ravid and say, I said the F word 20 times to Netanyahu on a call. But it's going to come into conflict with Trump's deal. And unfortunately, you and I talked about this, I don't know, like a year and a half ago about the Gaza situation. The only thing that potentially gets Trump to do anything toward Israel is when it starts to affect the Trump family business or Trump's ego. And so I'm very pessimistic about the chances for Lebanon, the Lebanon part of this sticking with any realness. It's possible. It's possible that there would be some framework that appears to be a ceasefire, but getting the Israeli troops to do a humiliation march out of southern Lebanon, that would be extraordinary. It's not unprecedented. Nasrallah famously, stood in victory before the world after what many in the region view was a Hezbollah defeat of the Israelis, 20 years ago. So it's not without a historical precedent, but under this nutcase in the White House, by the way, I know you've seen this, but I'll just tell your listeners in case somebody didn't hear this. A few weeks ago, I was told by the Iranians that they had enlisted the services of senior psychologists to start assessing what exactly is going on with Trump's brain. And, they talked about him being a psychotic individual. And so they started to work with mental health professionals to cater and edit and review the messages that they would send to the mediators to give to Trump. And they said that once they started working with these psychologists, they noticed that the responses started yielding results for the Iranian side.
Yeah.
And they attributed it in part to the way that the psychologists were helping them to craft their message so that Trump would respond to it. And so, we're in a situation where we have Trump just had 22 medical professionals involved with his, assessment, more than any other president has had for any of their single medical reviews. The Iranians and the mediators both recognize they're dealing with an unstable, erratic character. And the Iranians took the step of actually having psychological professionals working the case because it was probably the most responsible thing to do.
Yeah. So I think you and I both agree here, but I want to hear your perspective further on it, that this was a major pressure valve release for Donald Trump, right? Like Iranians did actually offer a tremendous gift to Donald Trump on his birthday. It sounds really silly when we have this conversation on these, childish terms, but unfortunately we do have a childish president. And I can't for the life of me figure out exactly what they saw from the Trump side that was different than a week ago or different than 2 weeks ago when this back and forth was taking place, or even different from the last time Israel felt like a deal was close and decided to hit Dahia, as they did earlier yesterday, that they saw something from the Trump side that was different this time around, that they were willing to offer him this massive W, this big moment of relief for the markets, which obviously is probably one of the only resilient pressure points for Donald Trump that he responds to.
Well, and also, the big boy was going to his fight match last night at the White House, and they had their carnival, and Don Jr. was up on the roof taking pictures. How awesome is this that we have this fight going on? And Trump got to go and have his happy birthday night watching the
G7 as well. Fight. He's going to go to the European leaders as he is right now to basically tell them that you guys suck.
He wants to cruise in. I'm the peace man. It was like the whole thing. It's the markets. It's the G7. It was his big night, at the White House with the UFC. But all I can share with you guys is just transparently the TikTok of how I started hearing about this stuff, because I actually think it's relevant. Last week, I was hearing very pessimistic tone from Iranian negotiators. They were saying everything is basically done, and it's been done since late May. Like, we've had this thing locked, and Trump keeps changing the game, issuing sweeping new demands. The mediators will come and they'll say the Americans have agreed to this. And then like an hour later, Trump posts something on social media. So they were saying nothing is happening. And I'm telling you, even hours before Trump made that announcement, the Iranians were saying, I think it was the night before Trump's announcement. So this was 2 nights ago. I was told, look, there are two main issues. They wouldn't tell me what they were, but they said there are two main issues that we've told the Americans are sort of our drop dead red lines that they're not budging on right now. And if there can be a creative solution to those, then we're going to all be able to announce this, that this understanding has taken place. And then yesterday, as I told you, I was told we're an hour or so away from attacking Israel in response to the bombing of Lebanon. And then, literally, I was going to publish that because it was what the plan was. And in fact, Iranians were saying this publicly. And then these meetings happen and the Qataris are there. And so I do think it's plausible, Hassan, that part of what happened is what the Iranians are saying, that Trump recognized that this Israeli attack on Beirut was going to mess up his entire deal. He recognized that the Iranians had a legitimate right to strike, that they had told Trump that they would strike if Netanyahu did this again, and that they would hold him responsible for it. And I think it is plausible that those issues the Iranians had identified and were having trouble getting past with the Americans via the mediators came through at the 11th hour because Netanyahu did that. I think that's plausible.
Yeah, that's what's being reported at this point. One of the things that we obviously can now rely on or look forward to, I guess, is not just like the Israeli posturing and the saber rattling, which there's plenty of that and plenty of crying from people who obviously care more about Israel's interest than even America's interest. But the other thing that we can look at now to figure out whether or not this deal is resilient, this MOU is real, is what Israel will actually do. So one of the Iranian memorandum of understanding points that I've heard over and over again, but again, we don't know if it's real or not, is the assurance that Trump gave Iran that Israel would not only stop bombing Beirut, but also pull its forces from Lebanon in its entirety. Now, that seems far-fetched, and I don't even know if it's even possible at this point, given the domestic considerations from Benjamin Netanyahu and how much Israeli society is up in arms, saying that this has been a spectacular failure. But obviously, America does have this power if they chose to make sure Israel is restrained, considering that Israeli fighter jets are actually American fighter jets. The munitions that they're deploying are actually American munitions. The jet fuel that they're using are actually American jet fuel that they're taking advantage of. So without America's go-ahead, Israel can't behave in this belligerent manner. So what do you suspect Israel will do is what I'm asking, because I think they're going to try to spoil this by taking bolder and bolder steps, and where Iran will probably recalculate their strategic military deterrence, like will they reestablish it, and Israel will see how far they can violate the red lines being drawn.
Yeah, this really, I think, is, if not the central question, it's one of the main ones that everyone should really keep their eyes on. Weeks ago, when Netanyahu started moving further north, when the Israelis started moving their troops further north, I said on a few of our streams and elsewhere that I suspected that what was happening is that Netanyahu wanted to push as far into Lebanon as he could, so that when the music stops, meaning when Trump does actually announce some kind of a deal, that the Israelis are deep into Lebanon, so that it gives the appearance that by simply ceasing fire for a period, that a deal has been achieved or a victory has been kind of won, in the sense that, okay, we've gotten everybody to stop shooting. Hezbollah is not firing, the Israelis are not firing, but the Israelis are then entrenched there. And it's much more difficult to get troops to withdraw than it is to stop firing. And now there's so many troops so deep into Lebanon that it would give the public appearance of a kind of humiliation march that happened as a direct result of Iranian intervention. And it's interesting, Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, had a call with Arachi today, and his tone shifted quite a bit, where he didn't specifically thank Iran for what it's done regarding Lebanon, but he acknowledged that the Iranians and he acknowledged that countries had included Lebanon in all of this, which is an interesting shift in his tone from some weeks ago, when he was basically telling Iran, we don't need your ceasefire, which was crazy. It's just pure lunacy. But so having said that, some Iranian sources and officials were saying and suggesting over the past 12, 15 hours that Trump had agreed that the Israelis were going to withdraw from Lebanon. When I first read that, I said, this would be an extraordinary term, because I had been read the exact text the night before. Now, it could have been changed. Maybe it is in there. But the text that I was read the night before that the Iranians said was what had been mutually agreed to mentioned nothing about the ground troops. It just stated a cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire. It didn't say anything about the withdrawal of troops. And the reason I remember it so vividly is because I've been asking about this repeatedly. Because ceasing fire is one thing, withdrawing the occupation forces is another thing entirely. We see the problem of that in Gaza. Well, the Israelis are both firing and moving deeper in with their occupation forces. So if it's in the deal, that's quite an achievement on the Iranians' part, because then the guarantor of that is Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And then the Iranians can rightly make the argument that this is an act of aggression against a party to the ceasefire, and the terms of it said they would withdraw, and they're not withdrawing. So Iran's position would be very strong to argue that. I'll be surprised, but I'll be impressed if that is a term in there. We'll have to wait and see. Somebody is claiming they're going to publish this thing. The real crazy thing that could happen is that competing versions could be published. Right now, we have J.D. Vance talking, we have Ghalibaf talking, we have Arachi talking, we have Trump talking. The rubber hits the road when we see what both sides have agreed to. And I suspect that, the longer this thing drags on, it's not to the benefit of this agreement. They need to publish this thing and show everyone what the actual agreement is. So I would say that the Israelis are unlikely to withdraw short of what you're describing. If Donald Trump really wants to make this a priority, he can get the Israeli troops out of there. All the bluster from Netanyahu and other politicians will go, they can cry all they want to the moon. If Trump wants them withdrawn, they're going to withdraw. That's just the story. The other thing is the issue that I see a bunch of commenters here from your community mentioning the $300 billion reconstruction fund. That's an interesting question. Iran has said differing things over the past 48 hours about where this is going to fit into the agreement and who's going to be funding it. The Iranian position is they want $300 billion as a reconstruction fund, and the funds for that are going to be provided by countries that participated in the attack against Iran, and they would define as that being those Gulf countries.
Yeah.
Now, Trump and Vance may see some utility to that scenario that is better than other forms of giving Iran money, where they basically say, this is a humanitarian gesture. Trump says he'll go and maybe he's even going to go to the quote unquote signing ceremony, that it's going to be a new day. And, the Gulf countries have generously decided to help poor Iran recover after, we had to obliterate all of these things because they wouldn't say that they wouldn't have a nuclear weapon. They could say that this fund exists for those purposes. We're getting some hints from the U.S. that something like that is going to be on the works. I don't know if it's going to be $300 billion, but it does seem like something's going to be there. We really don't know who's telling the truth until we see the document. Yeah. And I suspect that what they claim to have digitally signed isn't even the final thing, because I think there's still some very serious technical, at a minimum, technical issues being discussed ahead of this potential meeting on Friday.
Well, the other thing that we can also look at and interpret is troop positions, naval assets, whether they retreat in a meaningful capacity, and also oil tankers and other ships transiting through the Strait of Hormuz unimpeded. Because there's one element here where the Iranian side is saying that there are still going to be strict controls over who gets to transit through the Strait of Hormuz unimpeded, whereas the Trump side has very clearly stated that, no, all ships can now transit through the Strait of Hormuz. And then last but not least, once again, what Israel will do. There's a Haaretz article that just came out saying Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, not part of U.S.-Iran deal, a White House official says. So Israelis are very stern on this position that their sovereignty will not be violated by the American side. Now, of course, we know that that's, there is no such thing as Israeli sovereignty without the American go-ahead. So any kind of initiative that Benjamin Netanyahu takes here, if it doesn't follow significant punishments from the Trump side, like significant restraints from the Trump side, would imply that America is probably on board with what Israel is doing while simultaneously telling the Iranians something different.
But the Gaza analogy, I think, is relevant in a narrow set of ways. The deal that was signed between the Palestinian side and the Israelis in October of 2025 had maps for withdrawal of Israeli forces to, the so-called Yellow Line, and then it was going to be a further withdrawal and pullback. The Israelis have violated every possible aspect of the ceasefire, and in fact, they've moved deeper into Gaza. And My colleague Sharif Abdel Qaddus did a story recently based on satellite photos that were analyzed, by forensic architecture, showing the construction of what appear to be kind of military infrastructure in the eastern part of Gaza, where the Israelis seem to want to build some kind of a Potemkin village. But the point I'm making is that as the Israelis have violated this and they've moved deeper rather than further out of Gaza's territory, of Palestinian territory in Gaza, there's been no one to respond to that on a military level. Because if the Palestinians respond, they're going to say, oh, they violated the ceasefire. And then it's going to be, they're going to just go complete full-blown scorched earth on them again. And so the Palestinians have shown restraint. They've appealed to the international community. No Arab country is standing up for the Palestinians on a military level whatsoever. Iran did at times, during the Gaza genocide, but they don't have an Iran in their corner right now. Hezbollah is in a totally different position in that sense, because if the Israelis are violating a deal where Trump is the guarantor of it, and let's set aside the issue of the withdrawal of troops, because I tend to embrace your skepticism on this. As I told you last night, when I heard it, I was saying, okay, I'm skeptical of this. If they did it, I'll be very impressed. But I tend to doubt it. And the fact that American officials now are saying it's not part of the deal, we have to wait and see what's in there. But let's just say it's a ceasefire and the Israelis move deeper in, or there are reports they're going to send even more troops into Lebanon, or they're going to start hitting Beirut again. What lingers over the whole thing then, and Trump has to be aware of it, is that the Iranians could say, you're not going to stop them, we're going to stop them. And the Iranians start launching attacks. Then Trump's going to have to say, well, does the war resume again? Or do I say now that Israel gets to attack Iran again? Things could cascade into something really atrocious really fast as a result of this. So the Israelis are doing what they always do. And the question is going to be how Trump is going to handle it. But Hezbollah has a different guarantor than Hamas and the Palestinians have. And it's horrible for the Palestinians. It's absolute just living atrocity that we watch every single day. I hope people understand this, that whole situation there, more Palestinians have been killed than Israeli civilians died on October 7th since that ceasefire was signed. They don't allow the agreed upon aid to enter. They don't allow heavy construction equipment to enter. They are assassinating the very officials that they signed a ceasefire deal with, in addition to murdering children, women, and others on a daily basis. It's an abomination. But Hezbollah would say, if we're party to this agreement, then that means Iran gets to address ceasefire violations.
Yeah. And Kojat actually restricted additional humanitarian aid, including food, from going into Gaza right after they struck Dahia, and then Iran retaliated militarily.
Those who punished the Palestinians.
Exactly.
That's another thing.
This is the one speed
he's
they
going to
have.
continue to punish them.
Yeah.
The Palestinians, as this election season goes on, this is something. No one should stop talking about Palestine. We should not stop talking about Gaza. This is exactly what the Israelis want, because the Palestinians are going to be like their punching bag. They're going to be whipping them, killing them, murdering them, punishing them, occupying more of their territory. They're going to take out so much of their anger about whatever defeats Trump is negotiating his way into. They'll take it out on the Palestinians.
Which goes back to the same exact point over and over again that Israel has shown the rest of the region. Israel only responds and only retreats when there's sufficient military deterrence. Something that we also saw with our own two eyes, the strategic patience or the strategic restraint deployed by the former supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was something that Israel saw as perceived weakness. And perhaps they greatly underestimated the Iranian deterrence capabilities, and we saw that happen as well within the last 108 days now. Having said that, however, any kind of lack of response from the Iranian side, I believe, will be perceived as weakness, correctly or incorrectly, it doesn't matter, will be perceived as weakness by the Israeli side and certainly by the Trump administration as well. I mean, judging by, I'm not a psychiatrist, right? But judging by the way that Trump has talked about it, like any kind of concession, any kind of interest from the Iranian side to come to the table and follow along in a ceasefire negotiation, Trump perceives as weakness by the Iranian side. That the Iranians are scared, that they're worried that the American blockade is effective, that the American military response has been effective in deterring the Iranians from establishing sufficient military deterrence. So that's what we're going to see. I think, Israel is going to actively prick and actively try to undermine the establishment of the MOU. And until Donald Trump turns around and punishes Israel for it, if Iran if Iran doesn't retaliate, then they're going to keep pouncing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been debating this with some, friends who are Iranian academics and analysts too about this issue of if, let's say we get this MOU and the Strait of Hormuz is open and Trump finds a way to repatriate a substantial enough amount of Iranian frozen assets that the Iranians feel like they're keeping their deal. And there's something resembling a ceasefire in Lebanon. Maybe it's not that the Israelis fully withdraw, but there is some action that kind of bridges it from one week to the next, and we kind of move toward the nuclear negotiation issue. And then you're in a serious process. And instead of sending Trump's golf friends and Jared Kushner, they start to send technical experts, and the Iranians have their technical experts. And there starts to be incremental discussion about the lifting of sanctions. Let's say that starts to go on. The Iranian internal situation, we don't know entirely where it's going to fall. There certainly has been a rallying around the flag dynamic in Iran. There's no question about that. The huge displays in the street. Yeah. This is not just the party has told people to come into the streets. Iranians of a variety of political perspectives, including people who are opponents of the current Iranian government, have made very clear their opposition to the Israeli-U.S. war against their country and the threats of Trump to destroy their civilization. But when the kind of war footing starts to become different, and it becomes a negotiation footing, then the divisions within the political echelons of the society start to become more real, more textured. There's discussion about whether to ratify certain agreements. You also may have an appearance publicly, perhaps even at the funeral procession or the funeral services for laying to rest the late Supreme Leader. Maybe Mojtaba Khamenei is actually going to appear publicly and is going to give a speech, and we're going to get some sense of how he sees things. We do get information, but we haven't heard him give a speech. We haven't seen him give a speech. So all of that will play out. There will be political debate and discussion. Iran is not the monolithic one-party society that it's so reduced to in the American narrative. There is actual debate. There are differing points of view, and there's the broader context, which it's been strangled with economic sanctions for a long time. There's been financial mismanagement. There was the massive Bazari protests that took place. Before that, there were protests of oil sector workers. The anger at the government was real on financial matters. That doesn't mean that people were saying we want the state demolished or we want the government gone. Certainly some people want that. But Iran is a very diverse society on every possible level. And so when then that's your reality, Ghalibaf the other day said that this is the language we speak best. We can speak other languages, but this is the language we speak best. That was and referring to being on a war footing. When you're not on that war footing anymore and you don't have the constant specter of America and the Zionists attacking you, then you have to deal with what do the people actually believe now? And to me, that is going to be the next question. And when you have the U.S. and Israel trying to foment internal violent rebellion or insurrection or riots or attacking police stations or religious institutions, and you have an economic situation that isn't markedly improving, and you have people struggling, Iranians are like anyone else in the world. They don't want to have 100 times inflation. They don't want to have the price of carrots going up multiple factors from the time you get paid to the time you go to the market. No one wants to live like that in the world. It's perfectly normal to say, I don't like what my government is doing, or to recognize there's a foreign power involved with this, but also my government has its own responsibility. So when all those issues become the kind of dominant conversation on the street, then we'll see what kind of reality exists there. And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think anyone does right now. And I think that we're going to hear a lot from Iranians in the weeks and months to come, and we're going to understand where they fall on who's to blame for this and what they think should happen next.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy Scale, thank you so much for coming on. This was wonderful as always and very informative. I look forward to reading more about your reporting on the matter. Hopefully.
We can discuss it in London.
Yeah. Oh, well. Yeah,
terrible.
Well,
I was supposed to be with you
soon.
there, and then no, not too soon, man. This was outrageous. I went on Sky News then talking about your case, you and Cenk being banned, and now this Israeli group, this Israeli entity group, Camera is going after Yalda Hakim and Sky News for having interviewed me.
Yeah,
and it was during that interview that I was denouncing the UK's targeting of two of you and setting it in the context of what they're doing to Palestine Action, which now they've just upheld their prescription as a terrorist organization, these
Yeah.
heinous prison sentences that they just hit people with.
Yeah.
But I'm joking about you and I meeting in London, but I'm bringing it up because when they go after you, it then shed light on the fact that this is part of a sweeping attack on critics of Israel and an attempt to criminalize
Yeah.
activism on behalf of a people who are being subjected to genocide with the support of the British government and the American government. And it reminds us that all the counterterrorism laws in the US, if you trace it back historically, they all go back to trying to criminalize support for Palestine.
Yeah. I mean, the first ever legal mention in the legislature of terrorism comes from an anti-PLO measure, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, this is baked into America's like anti-terrorism, counterterrorism laws, and it is always, Israel has always been at the forefront of that initiative, and we're seeing it come to a, I guess, final conclusion because like they're exhausting all of the goodwill that remained in the Western world, where the overwhelming majorities are saying enough is enough, and they're demanding that their elected representatives recalculate their allegiance to Israel. And so I think Western countries now have a new calculation here. Do they abide by the democratic process? Do they allow there to be some kind of pressure valve to be released because the demands are getting overwhelming? Or do they just drop all pretense of democracy, the democratic process, and just show their voters, show their populations that they have no investment whatsoever in maintaining even a theoretical democratic process here, all at the behest of a foreign nation that is actively destabilizing global energy markets due to its own belligerent nature, due to its own belligerent ambitions of expanding, with unlimited support from the West, of course, the Greater Israel Project.
Yeah. Hey, Hassan, before I say bye, I also want to just mention, I mean, I often express my gratitude to your community of viewers and the audience you've cultivated. But I was thinking, when I saw you get banned and then Dropsite took a position that we would no longer participate in the South by Southwest conference because of the way that it responded to your banning, and the statement that they issued, which made it sound like it was a basic immigration matter that had no political, component to it at all. But, as we sort of discussed how we would respond to seeing this happen to you, we also, in part, it was political. It was clear, we should not be endorsing this, and we need to use our platform to make a statement about this. But also, it was when you knew that Dropsite was coming even before we launched it, and part of what we had no idea if anyone was going to read us or support us, and there were a handful of people, yourself and Amy Goodman, really prime among them, that we said, well, at least we know that those guys are going to try to tell people that this publication exists. And so I want to give big gratitude because your community of people were among the first people that signed up to become subscribers to Dropsite. So we'll forever be grateful to you for having our back right out of the gates.
Of course, and vice versa. I mean, I'm forever grateful that there are real investigative reporters out there who are not, stopping themselves from pursuing the truth and going out and talking to the supposed foreign adversaries that America actively tries to undermine the position of. There's no way to come to a reasonable conclusion without understanding the logical through line as to how these groups exist, why these groups exist, what their goals are, and what they're choosing to do. And so yeah, it's we all try to play a role in this in small part. So thank you.
Stay strong, Hassan, man. Don't let them get to you ever.
No, of course not. Thank you. Jeremy Scale, everybody, from Dropsite News.